Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Atlantic's Bob Cohn.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Festival. I'm Bob Cohn, the president of the Atlantic, and this morning we begin 3 days of conversation on the most pressing issues of our time. And let's be honest, we come together at a moment of national crisis. The rule of law is under threat, our institutions are failing, and the Constitution, a document that has held this country together for 231 years, is being tested as it has few times in our history. And that is the lighthearted topic for today. The health of the U.S. Constitution and the future of our systems of government. This conversation is playing out against a remarkable backdrop, one of those few times every decade when the legislative branch is called upon to provide advice and consent on an executive branch nomination to the highest court in the judicial branch. It's a constitutional trifecta, and we're fortunate to have with us later this morning two senators at the red-hot center of the debate, Republican Jeff Flake and Democrat Chris Coons. Our overall program this morning is in many ways a live version of the most recent issue of our magazine. I hope you all got a copy as you came in, or there's one near your seats. Is democracy dying? We asked on the cover. In the issue, our writers examine the very notion of democracy throughout the world and the impact of technology, bias, and the decline in civic participation on the health of our systems. Turning this issue of the magazine into an event was made possible through our partnership with the National Constitution Center, and I thank them for their support. So we begin today with a conversation about the underlying themes presented in that special issue of the magazine. Joining us, Jeffrey Rosen, the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. Ruth Marcus, deputy editorial page editor and a columnist at the Washington Post. Ibram Kendi, director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University and winner of the 2016 National Book Award. And leading the conversation, my friend and colleague, the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Hear me? Can you hear me now? It's already getting better. The state of our country. Thanks very much for coming. We did have quick introductions. All these people are very famous and well known and esteemed, so I don't have to introduce them further. I just want to say one further note about the special issue that I think all of you have or will get. It actually developed out of a conversation about a year ago I was having with Jeff, in which I asked him a very simple question. I said, what would James Madison make of our current moment? He answered in a 6,000-word, perfectly formed essay.
Which you cut down.
I just taped it on my phone, and then we published it. It was great. It was so easy.
Not true.
But that grew and grew and grew until we have what I think is a really fantastic issue with Jeff and Ibram and Stephen Breyer and Ann Applebaum and a whole bunch of other people in it. For this conversation, let's go right at the topic of our first conversation, which is we seem to be in a crisis, and I want to ask each of you in turn what you think the most pressing, what is the most pressing aspect of this crisis? What is the greatest threat to the continuity of our constitutional form of government? Why don't we start with you, Jeff, and maybe you could channel the Madisonian quality a bit, and then we'll go to Ruth and Ibram.
Well, thank you for asking this really important question, what would Madison think of democracy today? And what inspired me to the answer was a passage from Federalist 55. In all very large assemblies, of no matter what character controlled, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. So Athens is on Madison's mind. He's afraid of the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. He's convinced that direct democracies, where popular passions can be unchecked, will lead to demagogues. And that's why he devises the entire American system to create cooling mechanisms that slow down public discourse so that reasonable majorities can prevail. And what the piece tries to do is note that all of the cooling mechanisms Madison put in place are under siege. Congress is polarized more than any time since the Civil War, with red and blue America living in digital echo chambers and separate communities. The presidency is communicating directly with the people. A tweeting president is a Madisonian nightmare, because presidents are not supposed to communicate directly with the people. And the Supreme Court, with the prospect of 5-4 Republican versus Democratic decisions, represents the antithesis of the bipartisan legitimacy that Madison and Hamilton hoped. And most importantly, social media, Facebook and Twitter, have sped up public deliberation so quickly that they make possible the formation of digital mobs, undermining the advantages of the extended republic, which Madison thought would make it hard for mobs to discover each other and organize, and he thought passion could dissipate before they form. One really important point. For Madison, a mob can be a majority or a minority. A majority or a minority. The fact that we may have parties that are ruling that don't have a support of the majority of the whole is not an answer to the Madisonian problem. He defined a mob as any group animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And that is what we are having now, and that is the terrible crisis that our Constitution faces.
By the way, I just want to note that I also can quote large tracts of the Federalist Papers, but I just make a personal choice not to.
It's become a party trick.
No. It's one of the, only in Washington is that a party trick, by the way.
At 10 in the morning.
Ruth, the biggest threat.
So I'm here today as your designated quasi-optimist, and we can get to that later and sort of talk about the shreds of optimism that I'm clinging to. But the biggest threat may be a corollary or an outgrowth of the mob that Jeff is so eloquently disclaiming about, which is the wobbliest leg of the stool, our feckless legislative branch. Hope Jeff Flake is not in the hall yet. Don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. If you think about the elements of the national arrangement that have done well to adequately over the last difficult months, the judiciary well to adequately, and we'll see how that proceeds. The media more well than adequately, despite the scary fact that last month we had one White House press briefing. That is a scary part of our constitutional arrangement, but nonetheless, we persist. And then, you have the excesses of an unchecked presidency, which leads me to the feckless branch, the legislature, which, and I don't think it's passion that's motivating them, though it may be the passion of the mob that is creating this arrangement. It is fear. They know what is right, and they are afraid, too many of them, too often, to stand up and say it. They look at it in many lawmakers that I speak to in a crass realpolitik situation of, if I speak up, he, meaning he, who shall not be named, and his mobs of followers and his Twitter followers will besiege my office through social media, through telephones, and they will crush me at the ballot box. They will not necessarily crush me at the ballot box in the general election, but we have this unfortunate primary situation that's going on. So we have an arrangement that I think that Madison and his buddies could not have conceived of, and it's not unique to this moment, but it is uniquely bad at this moment, where we have a legislative branch that is too often cowering in fear of doing what it knows to be the right thing. So that's my big, from the gloomy piece of my hat, that's the biggest threat.
Ibram, in your excellent piece for The Atlantic, you talk at length about what remains America's original sin. Could you just give us in a minute or two the thesis and talk about the way in which the perpetuation of racism prevents us from being the more perfect union that we all dream of?
Sure. I think for the piece, of course, I decided to use Lincoln's famous House Divided speech in 1858, in which he made the case that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And he believed this government cannot permanently endure half slave and half free, or become all one thing or all the other. And I made the case in the piece that instead of thinking of the divide right now between slavery and anti-slavery, we should think of the divide between racist and anti-racist. And this sort of original sin and this sort of persisting division is essentially between those who are led to believe that the problem in our society is people, particularly people who don't look like them, particularly people who don't live in their neighborhoods. And others, I think, have come to recognize that the problem is policy. And really, because I think from the founding of this country, we've had racial inequity. And people have been trying to understand why this inequity exists and persists, and we've been arguing about it from the beginning. Is it bad policy or bad people? And fundamentally, we're going to have to come together and recognize that it's bad policy, and that because by thinking it's bad people, we fundamentally remain divided, and it's very difficult for a nation to persist and endure permanently with such searing divisions.
Jeff, add on to that, if you will. I'm wondering if the system was designed to grapple with the level of demographic change in relations between gender, change in differences from region to region, the formation of all kinds of faction is what Madison was worried about, faction broadly defined. Is this country simply becoming too, and I use this word in a technical, narrow sense, too diverse in what it is and what the needs of different regions and different peoples are, or the fears of different peoples are, to actually unify around a single creed, a creed encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution?
You were so right to cite Lincoln as well as Madison, and Lincoln is directly channeling Madison when in his speech, which I found since the piece came out and after reading your amazing piece, 1838, the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Lincoln is afraid of mobs. He's seeing Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist newspaper editor, lynched to protect his presses. He's seeing African Americans being lynched as well as white people. And he says, the mobocratic spirit is in the land. We are being governed by passion rather than reason. I am afraid that even people of goodwill who have allegiance to the country will be seduced by demagogues like Caesar and Alexander. Just as Madison feared demagogues, so did Lincoln. And he says to these young men of Springfield, the only solution is reverence for the Constitution and the laws. Let it be taught from every cradle. Let every mother and father teach it to every prattling babe. We must imbibe this reverence for the Constitution. It has to become a kind of political religion, Lincoln says. So it's an astonishing speech. And it reminds us that things have been very bad before. We're more polarized than at any time since the Civil War, but we were this polarized before.
We are more polarized right now, in your view, than any time since the lead up to the Civil War.
It's actually just after the Civil War. Norbert McCarthy from Princeton has run the numbers, and after the Civil War, the divide between Republicans and Democrats was as great as it is since then. It hasn't been this great since then. In 1960 in Congress, 50% of the most conservative Democrats overlapped with the most liberal Republicans. Today there's no overlap. So we've been there before, but of course we had a Civil War the last time, and the question is...
So it is a question. If this decade is analogous in some ways, I'm trying to be very cautious about the way I phrase this, if this is the 1850s, then what's the next decade that we're looking at? I mean, do either of you see any cause to believe that we're going to wake up one morning and go, you know what, we need to reimpose restraint on our behavior and our speech in order to recognize the fact that we're trying to live together in one country under one system? Do you see anything to make you happy? Anything at all, really. It's early. Let's try.
Well, I mean, I see people resisting. I see young people sort of imagining and dreaming of a different world. But on the other hand, I see people arming themselves. I see people joining organizations that imagine that their people are experiencing a genocide and they're seeking to take America back, and they see their president basically championing that sort of effort. And I also see those people terrorizing more Americans than any other group of people. And I also see Americans, and particularly white Americans, particularly middle-income white Americans, imagining that a more anti-racist, egalitarian America is against their self-interest, which actually is not. And so there are so many different ways in which I see it getting worse, and we see the violence. And really, that was, when we think about the 1850s, a lot of the violence was occurring on plantations. I mean, there was a lot of resistance going on plantations. There was a lot of pro-slavery theorists who were upset about abolitionists in the North speaking out against slavery. I mean, there was all sorts of violence continuing to bubble up.
We're going to take questions from the audience in a couple of minutes, but let me go to Ruth just for a comment on this. And this is a question that I get, you get, anybody from the so-called mainstream media gets this question all the time, which is, how do you reach that 30 to 40% of Americans, mainly white, overwhelmingly white, mainly not coastal, quote-unquote, coastal elites? How do you reach them with what you think of as your fact-based discourse about the way the country is going, about the divisions in the country, about the behavior of the president? Have you figured out how to bridge that divide?
Yes, but I can't tell you.
You have a formula? But if you join Amazon Prime, however, but go into this a little bit. I'm curious to know how you think about this, because it does seem to me that we can divide up America into many different kind of tribes right now, but there is that tribe, the tribe that no longer believes what we believe to be flawed, but earnest effort to present observable empirical reality so that people can make informed decisions. How do you get over that chasm?
So I do want to answer that question, but I want to sort of get into my designated optimist role for just a second to say...
This is self-designation, by the way. I did not designate.
You did, but that's okay.
Well, we'll agree to disagree.
But self-designation as well, which is not to say naive dupe. I'm just designated optimist. 1860s, but also let's recall 1960s. 1968 was a very scary moment, a very scary year. Rioting in streets, college students rioting and killed, a nation really torn apart. We've been in bad places at many points in our history, and we have healed. I think and we are at a bad point now, but it is a point that Trump is obviously both a cause and a symptom. We got Trump because we were not in a good place as a nation going into the election, but at the same time, 3 million more votes for Hillary Clinton, oddities of an antiquated electoral college system. I'm not blaming you, but you are the Mr. Constitution.
I just convened the discussions.
And a bunch of bad, potentially malign acts that yielded this. We could be having a not completely different conversation, but a significantly different conversation. And I think back to the night that feels so long ago now that Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, and we thought of our country in a very different way. So that's a little bit of the happy talk gloss on, a situation that I agree is not the perfect moment now. One thing that increasingly concerns me that we've alluded to but haven't talked about on that is the role of technology. The role of technology, she said, speaking into her microphone, in exacerbating all of this. It exacerbates the mob. It exacerbates the regional demographic sorting that creates the kind of pre-existing tribalism. So
well,
that is on the downside.
We're going to talk about that in a next panel. But go to this issue of Madison.
So I oversee the op-ed page at pages at the Washington Post and the opinion section online, and we have been, since the election, during the election, and especially since the election, extremely dedicated to the proposition that that people can say liberal Washington Post, even the liberal Washington Post sometimes, and people can dismiss us, starting with and trickling down from the president, but that we need to be, and I know you've tried this, Jeff, a home for vibrant, intellectually honest, robust debate that includes and reflects the reality that 40% of people voted for Donald Trump, and we are serving it to people. And you know what? It suggests that our readers, wherever they are in the political spectrum, are willing to consume across the political spectrum. And there will be people who never go to the Washington Post, but we need to, and I think all of our colleagues across the media landscape need to serve people two things. One is facts, because facts really matter. And the second is respectful discourse across the ideological divide, because if we can't have that, we really are in trouble.
We're going to go to questions. Do we have any? Oh, right here. Please also keep these questions short and in the form of a question. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Andy Bloom, avid reader. Some have called for a constitutional convention and say one could be within 4 or 5 years. What are your thoughts on that?
Madison was avidly opposed to another convention. He thought it was a miracle that the first one worked. He thought it was divine providence, and he was really afraid.
Is that because it was done in secrecy, largely?
Secrecy was crucial. Imagine a tweeting convention. This is a central point, that if the South had tweeted out their position before the negotiations happened, both sides would have dug in their heels and compromise would have been impossible. The fact that it was secret was necessary, and many think that the transparency of Congress has contributed to polarization. But Madison thought that a second convention would be composed of the same state legislators who were creating mobs in the states, and they might repeal the whole thing. Now, 27 states have called for a constitutional convention for a balanced budget amendment. You only need 7 more, if that's right. So you could, in theory, have one. It's not inconceivable. We've had debates at the National Constitution Center. And I should say, by the way, I've got to quickly explain what we are. The Constitution Center is the only place in America created by Congress to bring liberals and conservatives together for constitutional education and debate. We have these amazing debates in Philadelphia and across the country and online, and this online constitution that brings together the top liberals and conservatives to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing areas of agreement and disagreement. But for our should we have a constitutional convention debate, the audience voted before. Initially, everyone was for it. And then when David Super of Georgetown Law School got up and said, imagine at this moment, you really want to run the risk of a rogue convention repealing the First Amendment and the whole thing, the audience changed its mind and voted against. But you could have one. It would take either a vote of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, which is unlikely to happen because Congress doesn't want to restrict itself in this way, or 2/3 of the state legislatures could call a convention of the states, and then that would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of conventions held in each state. And the final thing to say is, even if the convention goes rogue, it's unlikely that a totally crazy proposal could get through 3/4 of the states, so that's the argument for a convention.
Either of you?
I'm with Madison.
You with Madison?
I think I'd like some amendments to the...
Those are in the Atlantic tent on, we can find the new amendments if you want. We're selling them today. Right here.
I'm Elizabeth Griffith. I'm a historian. My question, do you think you could name 5 democratic values that all the tribes of our current nation could agree to?
Congress shall make no law respecting freedom of speech, abridging the freedom of conscience, allowing unreasonable searches and seizures, The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, particularly describing the place to be searched and the thing to be seized.
Show off.
It's such, no, I teach this stuff, so, but this is our, now the reveal.
You know, we have Red Bull back there. It's the Red Bull. This is what's doing.
No.
But wait, I want to argue.
This is the reveal. These are the values. These are the values. We ascribe to them. We embrace them. We must revere them.
But Jeff, to be fair, we know that, Jeff, you've been on college campuses. I've been on college campuses. You don't see among certain millennials, you don't see a reverence for the idea of a First Amendment in the way that you do see. The people, there's a broad school of thought that says that freedom of speech is a way that the ruling majority white male overlords of this country used to suppress marginalized people and marginalized speech. You've heard this argument. I don't even know if you buy the argument, but these things are not universally understood to be good things anymore.
There's agreement.
People are created equal.
Absolutely.
Well,
no,
right, Jeff, Jeff, why don't we let just Ruth?
But that's very important. The whole theory of American government is in the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, which I won't recite, but that is the American creed.
Ruth?
So I think I'm going to go dark now.
I was getting really sunny.
It's just an emotional roller coaster up here.
I love those words, but I think the very eloquent reasons that you explained why we shouldn't have a constitutional convention now explain why it's a little bit up in the air about whether we really could get the vast agreement on those propositions today.
Right. Go to this question on the First Amendment for starters.
Well, I think one of the things that I think millennials, and I guess I'm a millennial, have been making the case.
Always wanted to meet one of you.
I think they're not articulating it as such, but I think what they're saying is that there's a such thing as unfree speech, and unfree speech is speech that is false, that's violent, that's damaging, and that's the speech, of course, that they're pushing back against, in their spaces and on their campuses. And to your sort of point about a democratic value, I would say all men are created equal, but I think I would sort of advance that and develop that to our time to say that all groups are equal. I think it's very subtle, but it's a very interesting difference, because when you say created, that means certain groups become inferior, and so therefore we have to civilize and develop them. But if you say all groups are equal right now, then we can literally talk to each other on the same plane.
I want time for one more quick question, if we have it. Yeah, over here. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Lane Woolerton. First off, very impressed, Mr. Rosen, with your resuscitation abilities.
No, it really is a trick.
I can do the preamble to the Constitution to Jingle Bell Rock, but I won't do that.
Whoa.
My question is, there are some out there, my father being one of them, who are conservatives. They say they're not supporters of Donald Trump, but that he is important because he's putting the issues on the table. My question is despite all of the disparity that we have and the inability to have civil discourse in this time, is there some productivity to having him in office? Did we need Trump, and are we somehow better for it? I realize that's a challenging question.
Why don't you give 3 quick answers there?
I'll do mine. The first thing that comes to mind is something that's happening in my profession that I've never experienced before, which is for all of the attacks on the media as the enemy of the people and how chilling that is, and for all the ferocity of being yelled at by people at Trump rallies as liars and scum. People are coming up and thanking me and my colleagues in a way that I find kind of unsettling and unwarranted, but still really quite lovely and heartwarming, thanking us for what we do. And I think that kind of goes to the question of whether there is a kind of majority for enduring values. And those thanks are something we didn't get into journalism for. It's not why we do it, but it is a very lovely byproduct of this horrible era.
And I'd say very briefly that I think for those who are resisting the power in the White House, if there was a different power that they supported, they would sort of not be looking in the mirror for power. They would not be looking to organize power within their own communities. And I see people doing that all over the country, literally waking up each day and looking in the mirror and saying, how can I change this country? As opposed to expecting someone in Washington, D.C. to do it for them.
The Constitution Center is nonpartisan, so we can't take a position on our current president, but I can say with total nonpartisan certainty, it is a healthy thing for democracy that all of you now understand constitutional structure matters. Institutions matter. It is not a joke to have the Senate blow itself up through polarization. It's not a joke to have the possibility of a Supreme Court deciding cases by 5 to 4 liberal conservative votes. We have an opportunity, in fact, a duty to study this document. All of these wonky things you said, you sang the jingle from school. Separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, even the contracts clause, which is designed to stop state mobs from favoring debtors over creditors. All these are central to the survival of the American Republic. It is very serious. And if that is a byproduct of our current vexations, then we have the president to thank.
I want to thank these 3 great panelists, and we'll see you again shortly. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey, Ruth, Ibram, and Jeff. I'll have to agree with the last questioner. My instinct was that Jeff Rosen should record a Schoolhouse Rock on the Constitution. Those of you of a certain age will remember that. We'd also like to thank the Gallup organization for its support today and for hosting us in this beautiful and historic building. I'd like to welcome Gallup's editor-in-chief, Frank Newport, to report on some of Gallup's latest findings on Americans' trust in government.
Thank you. My assignment was to discuss trust in government in 5 minutes, and then the next 5 minutes I'm going to discuss the impact of wars in the history of mankind, right, with specific examples and so forth. All by way of saying it's much too much to try to summarize, but let me just make a few salient points. And as I stand here, I want to make it clear that I represent the American public. My job is, and people often get mad at me at cocktail parties because they'll say, well, what do you think about the death penalty? And I'll say, well, a majority of Americans still support the death penalty. And they'll say, no, what do you think? And I say, I don't have opinions. I subvert my ego. I try to represent what the American public believes, because that is our job, or my job here at Gallup, and has been for decades, to try to understand what people are thinking and feeling. That's relevant to what I'm going to say in just a moment about our elected representatives as well. Trust in government is low. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, there are numerous examples. If I had a traditional PowerPoint, I could go on for 30 minutes showing you slides. The perceived honesty and ethics of members of Congress are down there very close to used car salesmen and lobbyists. If there are lobbyists in the room, I apologize, but those are both, all 3 at the very bottom of our scale. About 37, 38% of Americans now are satisfied with the way the nation is being governed, which means a significant majority are not, and the litany of these types of things could go on. Actually, trust in government on some of our indicators is up slightly in recent survey work we just did in September, partly because Republicans, after the first year of having been not sure about government, have come around, and their numbers supporting the government have actually come up some, because I think Republicans are saying, aha, our control of the presidency and the legislative branch have actually produced some more positive results. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that trust in government is quite low. I think some of these comments were very germane, because I think a key point from the perspective of the public is this is not new. I found a nice quote from Dr. George Gallup, the founder of Gallup, from decades and decades ago. Way back in the 70s, quote, I am so disturbed by the disillusionment Americans have expressed through our surveys with the workings of the political system. So this is not a new phenomenon. I think, as we've heard so eloquently here, the founding fathers would certainly not be totally shocked, were James Madison here, that we're saying there is a discord, there is tension between the American people themselves here and their elected representatives over here. I think there has, however, and this is a key point that I wanted to make, been an inversion. I'm not a constitutional expert, as was Mr. Rosen here, but I nevertheless have some views. And I think where Madison was very concerned about the factions of the people and the need to get an elected representative body to adjudicate and moderate and deliberate to come up with better outcomes than the people would themselves, I think we've seen a flip. And I think we now have the people, who I believe in deeply, sitting here saying, we are concerned about the factions of our elected representatives, and we, the people, need to deliberate and adjudicate and moderate on these people. So it's actually the American public who are looking askance at their deliberative bodies and saying, what can we do about this? Now, a key factor here, I believe, is ideologues. I love that word. We have people who now believe they know what truth is, and anybody who disagrees is incorrect. That's what I call ideologues. One of the most important pieces of data we have that we just collected again shows that 12% of Americans believe that their elected representatives should be principled and stick to principles. Another 10% kind of shade in that direction, which is 22%. So the vast majority of Americans say we do not favor our elected representatives being ideologues and sticking to principles at all costs. Rather, we want our representatives to be non-ideological, may take views to Congress, but at the same time be willing to trade off and deliberate. So what can be done about this is the key question. We could elect ideologues who take their principles to Congress and then are willing to trade off when they get there. This seems unlikely, and there are a lot of reasons for that, including the way our elections take place now. Fino's paradox, of course, points out that most representatives get reelected, even though as a body Americans are saying we don't represent or don't like what they're doing. So that's very difficult there. We could also elect more non-ideologues to Congress, right, to be our representatives, and therefore they would be more likely to do the kind of things the American public wants them to do. How likely is that? That's questionable as well. Our data show that there are probably 4 things that the American public would favor, some of which are more dramatic than others. One is redistricting, which is underway in a lot of places, but very difficult to actually effectuate in most states. The second would be higher turnout themselves, to get the American public to turn out in higher numbers. That's tricky. The American public think this would be great if we could all turn out, but they themselves are the ones not turning out. The third thing would be third party. Our current data we just came up with showed that a significant majority of Americans favor a third party, say the R's and the D's are not doing an adequate job of representing the public. That's very difficult. Michael Bloomberg, right, who has unlimited resources and would be the independent candidate, gave up, right? He said, given the system, even with my billions, I can't get elected as an independent. So if he does run in 2020, as you've heard, he says, I'll have to run with one of the 2 major parties, and he's tilted to the Democrats from what I understand. A third movement would be, a fourth solution might be something similar to the Tea Party movement, but would be a compromise party movement. How's that? Which I'm not willing to push forward, but if you had a charismatic leader, we might be willing to see more candidates elected to office who could represent the concept, the idea that ideological rigidity is not what the public wants at this point. They want people who can trade off and come up with decisions. How likely are all these to happen? Well, we'll wait and see, right? Maybe we'll ask our 2 senators here who come up later how likely that is to happen. In closing, back to Dr. George Gallup again, and this shows my bias, right? My own trying attempts to sublimate my own ego in favor of what the people themselves said and I think the reason I raised that at the outset, and I'm now raising that as I close, is I think that would be great for our elected representatives to sublimate their own egos and say, you are not born more brilliant than most other people in this country. You may have ideas, right? But your ideas aren't necessarily any more brilliant than the ideas from the collectivity of the people or other elected representatives. Push the ego down. Instead, say, let's try to find a solution to the problems rather than adamantly sticking to this particular concept that I've come up with. Dr. George Gallup said in 1978, the judgment of the American people is extraordinarily sound, which I would adhere to. And in closing, Dr. Gallup said back in 1978, and I would adhere to at this moment, the public is almost always ahead of its leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank, for those insights. The emergence of a compromise party does sound attractive, but I have to say increasingly far-fetched at this moment in time, at least. We want to spend a few minutes now exploring just what's behind the dwindling trust that Frank Newport talked about. His findings suggest a few important questions. At a time of tribal division and so-called fake news, how can trust in media be restored? And likewise, given the growing dysfunctions in Washington, how can trust in the institutions of government be restored? To tackle these questions, please welcome back Jeffrey Rosen, and also Atlantic contributing editor and co-host of Showtime's The Circus, Alex Wagner, and with them, Jeff Goldberg.
Probably just could have sat here, I guess. Here we are, we're walking in now. We're going to, I think, sort of in a way, pick up where we were on this subject, but with the notable addition of Alex. Thank you.
Very notable.
Extremely notable addition of Alex. Maybe we can start with the question that I put to Ruth Marcus a few minutes ago, which is, I think, from a practical standpoint and an ideological, philosophical standpoint, one of the hardest things people in the press are facing today, which is how do you convince people who are predisposed because of ideology, resentment, philosophy, religion, tribe, region, whatever it is, predisposed not to believe things you in the press know to be true because you've studied it empirically. You're on the road a lot, talking to many, many Trump voters.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your experience in trying to convey the idea that the MSM is not the enemy of the people, to borrow a phrase.
Mm-hmm. Well, I begin everything by trying to reassure them that I'm not a hologram orchestrated by the Clintons.
Right.
That's not true. I don't do that. The first thing I would say, just in response to your question, is I'm not an advocate. I'm a journalist, right? So it's not that I'm trying to convince people of the righteousness.
No, but you're an advocate for the idea that the press stands for the truth, flawed, whatever, but stands for the truth.
So, and it is remarkable. You go to Trump events, you go to Trump rallies, and the resistance to what we think of as commonly shared facts is fairly profound on everything from family separation policies to airstrikes in Syria. I mean, there are a number of things where there literally exists an alternate reality where none of the things we know to be true are true. So in my questioning I think one of the things that you can't do when you're interfacing with Trump supporters or people who don't share these facts or a belief in these facts is not to put them on the defensive. I mean, my tact usually is to understand what they think to be true and then to sort of question them repeatedly about for example, on family separation, someone said that was an Obama-era policy. And I sort of tried to dig into what exactly they thought Obama had done to dictate this policy, or how it was a vestige of the Obama administration. And if you ask people enough times, you eventually get to the kernel of the thing they think is true. And that is where it's easier to sort of debunk what is false. I mean, usually in all this theory making on the dark side of the internet or at Fox News, there's some sort of thing a kernel of veracity around which an elaborate sort of fake theory has been built.
What part of the critique of the mainstream media emanating from Trump supporters from the right, what part do you actually agree with, if anything? Do you see some reason, some justifiable reason for people to have this resentment and mistrust, so on?
I think yesterday is a great case in point. There is a feeling on the part of Trump supporters and a lot of conservatives that the mainstream media does not cover legitimate wins. The renegotiating of NAFTA is a legitimate win for this White House. It has been completely overshadowed by the Kavanaugh confirmation. That's a function of the way media works and profits and ratings. But it also, I think, feeds this narrative that, look, even when he does something that's actually good and it is an accomplishment, it gets no coverage. And I do think, because most media is generated and is taped and is broadcast out of coastal cities like New York and DC, there is a lack of an understanding about what actually matters to people in the middle of the country and how they think about the world. I think we've tried to correct for that since 2016 because so much of us missed the story. But that, I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't live in Ohio, if you don't live in Missouri, if you don't live in Nevada, you're not going to understand the crosswinds in the same way. And that is not necessarily bias. That's a matter of fact. But if you overlay that with the stories we do cover and the importance we give them, I think it does give us, you know, a sense of injustice in terms of whether we are fair in our coverage.
Right. Jeff, talk about the history a little bit of the partisan press. We feel as if we're in a hyper-partisan moment in American history, but the truth of the matter is, for much of American history, the press has been almost entirely partisan and divided, echo chambers and filter bubbles and all the rest in the pre-digital era. Talk about that and tell us if you see some cause for hope that we're maybe in a trough right now, but we go in and out of these things rather than being in a kind of terminal decline toward two camps that just do not accept any set of common facts.
The press of 1800 makes our current one seem mild. The insults that people hurled at each other, Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall calling each other the great llama of the mountain, and it's not clear what that means, to be a llama.
The great llama of the mountain.
Sounds like a compliment.
Isn't that shocking? No, it's the worst thing to be a llama. It's appalling.
I mean,
and Marshall twistifications and so forth.
I'm going to try that on Lindsey Graham tomorrow. See if it works. Yeah. Well, you're the great llama of the mountain.
It had something to do with being in Monticello and looking down at everyone.
Like liberals in the ivory tower, or just the ivory tower.
Exactly.
The Llama Mountain.
And the duel of Burr and Hamilton was inflamed by stuff that was in the newspapers. And at the Constitution Center, we have the originals of the letters and so forth, and much of this ended up in the press. And the National Gazette, where Madison wrote his essays defending the Constitution, and remember the Federalist Papers originally appear in the newspapers, is a virulent anti-Federalist organ. At the same time, these things had limited reach and they were distributed slowly. So Madison, in his essays on national government in 1791, written in this partisan National Gazette, expresses the hope that at some point, an enlightened class of journalists that he calls the literati, basically it's the staff of the Atlantic, of all the lettres, that the literati will slowly disperse reason across the land, and that people will take the time to read complicated arguments, and this will obviate the dangers of the extended republic. The bad thing about having a really big country is that people can't discover facts. The good thing is that mobs can't formalize. He thinks because the press it's a mass circulation newspaper, but it travels slowly, all the partisan stuff will be mixed with these long, complicated arguments which people will take the time to read, and reason will prevail. The problem now is the speed of deliberation. I mean, this is we've been partisan before, the press has been partisan before, but we didn't have Twitter. Yeah. And the other obvious difference is now everyone is a journalist. And in many ways, that's a wonderful, empowering thing that everyone can express their opinions in real time, but it also allows for the quick formation of mobs in a way that has undermined the institutional media and makes things
It's a question for both of you, and it's a simple one. Can our form of democracy survive Twitter and everything it stands for?
You know, it's a serious... You go first, because I want to think about
it. I think when we look back on the Trump presidency, assuming he is one day no longer president, I think that we will talk about a lot of things, but he did, one of the longest lasting pieces of his legacy may be the fact that he revolutionized the way presidents communicated with the American people. And I mean, his Twitter habits have changed our democracy. They've changed journalism in terms of what we cover. I mean, they've shifted the scale in terms of what's important. Trump's tweets can knock the most important sort of policy news or foreign news out of the ballpark immediately on any station around the country.
And he knows it. He's strategic.
And journalists are constantly forced into the position of defending why it's worth covering a tweet. And our position is usually, well, this is the President of the United States effectively.
It's a presidential statement.
It's a presidential statement. All right, that did not, I mean, Obama tweeted, but it was not with the same, he was not as promiscuous, he was not, I mean, he was not as...
Obama tweeted about national parks he was visiting.
Yeah,
it was a
exactly. It was very strategic. Trump, it's like his, I mean, it is the closest thing we have to inside his brain, and therefore it is like very, well, but it is. I mean, I think it is very much
There's no filter, yeah.
There isn't. And that, I think the expectation, it will be interesting to see if the next president, whoever he or she may be, what he or she does with that medium. Because I feel like as complicating and difficult as it is for us to all navigate, it's an incredibly useful tool as well.
But Twitter is the opposite of a cooling mechanism.
It's
it's the heating mechanism. So can we survive it?
The most alarming Twitter study recently, a couple weeks ago, the Times published a survey showing that people who are exposed to the opposite point of view on Twitter become more polarized, not less. In other words, they dig in their heels, and it has to do with the way that people define themselves tribally. So the hope that by listening civilly to different points of view, people could collaborate is not true when the tweets are short and fast. In these kind of settings, when you bring together people of different perspectives, people can change their minds. And the coolest thing the Constitution Center does, the anti-Twitter, is this weekly podcast where I get to call up the leading liberal and conservative scholar of the week to debate the constitutional issues of the week. And we had the thrilling experience of having two scholars on treason, the liberal and conservative scholar, because the definition of treason is really wonky. You need giving aid and comfort to enemies, two witnesses, or confession in open court. Once the two sides debated it, the conservative decided there was a stronger case for treason against the president if the facts were proven than he had thought before hearing the arguments on the other side. So that suggests that when you take the time to disaggregate, and time, the central question is time, and I want to plug Greg Wiener's amazing book, Madison's Metronome, which notes the centrality of time in the framers' vision of deliberation. You have to slow things down so that people can take the time.
But this is quixotic. I mean, this is really quixotic what you're talking about. You're talking about a podcast with constitutional scholars.
Podcast is available on Parchment. Really
that's right. That's right. That's right. It could be mailed to you, right? But compare that to the demagogues of the left and right and their instant ability to communicate to millions of people. It's not a fair fight, Jeff.
Well, that's where the institutions come in, and that's why you must have strong institutions of Congress to check the presidency and the Supreme Court to check the Senate and the House and the president and the executive. And if the institutions are doomed by Twitter, and we were just talking before about the ways that Twitter has undermined deliberations in Congress, the Supreme Court doesn't tweet, and the case for cameras in the courtroom is different because you'd have Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia said, if you could have federal marshals in every house forcing people to watch the entire argument from beginning to end, he'd support it. But he fears that little snippets of the arguments would be taken out of context. And now with Twitter, that fear becomes more real, that you could actually reduce the arguments to acontextual snippets. So the institutions are crucial, and I think that's the only thing they can say about it.
I guess to that point, though, I do worry that the institutions have realized the only way that they remain relevant and the people in those institutions retain their jobs is by inflaming passion. I mean, right? Look at Lindsey Graham, sitting on the Senate Judiciary Committee for a Supreme Court nomination, issues this sort of like dramatic monologue, the likes of which, I mean, he's not the kind of person that typically does that. It'll be interesting to see what you have to say to him tomorrow, but I think a lot of people believe, whether or not this is fair, that Donald Trump won 2016 because Hillary Clinton couldn't connect with voters. She didn't have the same emotional relationship. And so when you have institutions, whether the presidency or the Senate or to some degree the House, where success is predicated on making an emotional connection with the public and the electorate, why get rid of social media if it helps foster that connection?
So the looming question is our ability to snap back to previous norms. Correct? I mean, after the Trump presidency, do we just revert to form, or is the genie just out of the bottle?
As a member of the media, we talk about there is like this sort of dirty acknowledgement that Trump has been very good for the media because people are reading more, people are discussing more, people are tuning in more. It's hard to imagine the media saying at the end of this, and I think the voters have been inoculated to this as well, oh, like let's just take a break. Isn't it good to have everything reset to zero? I mean, everybody wants a break to some degree, but I don't know that you're going to have like the side, if politics goes back to the status quo pre-Trump, I don't know that anybody is going to be particularly actually relieved. I mean, I do think people, I don't know. I do feel like there's an incredible appetite. I mean, it won't always be able to operate at this level of frenzy, but I don't know.
People like the circus. No, I mean, yes.
Like I said, the stakes feel incredibly high. People are incredibly invested, and that's legit. That has nothing to do with this other thing that I'm talking about, which is like the game of it all.
But Jeff, isn't there a reason to hope in some way, and I'm putting my thumb on the scale of what I'd like to see return to, but that every presidency is a reaction to a previous presidency. You elect a certain kind of person, and you elect somebody who's very, very different. I mean, what are the chances that, I mean, looking back in history, what are the chances that the next president is the most boring person ever to achieve the highest office?
I mean, the contingency of history is so striking, and Buchanan followed by Lincoln, or the catastrophe of Johnson picked by accident, and so forth. So anything's possible. The scary possibility, which we're talking about now, is, are these changes structural? If Madison was right, and it's direct democracy leads inevitably to demagogues, then the next president is as likely to be a celebrity liberal as a celebrity conservative.
Because I don't think Donald Trump is president because Barack Obama was boring. Right? I think that in terms of policy and other things, there's the sort of back and forth nature of America. But this other thing of the Trump presidency, which is frenzy, passions inflamed, like that's just a separate thing entirely. I think that exists as an inflection point in history, less than a natural sort of sine curve in terms of emotion.
We're going to do questions in a minute, but why do you two think that there has been quite obviously insufficient sanction for a president who, when a lie, an untruth, a misleading statement is pointed out, doesn't correct but doubles down? I mean, that's one of the innovations of this presidency, I would say. No. I mean, this is just observable truth. I mean, that all politicians lie. When you catch them on a lie, when we in the media catch them on a lie, they trim, they walk things back, they sometimes apologize. Here we have a system in which there's no quarter is given. And obviously, he's rewarded for this, or insufficiently sanctioned. So where did it's not where the institutions fail, where did the norms fail? Were the norms insufficiently strong?
First of all, I do think it's partly institutional. I mean, I think that there is an entire wing of conservative media that doesn't ask him to fact check or correct himself, and his supporters watch and digest that news media, so they don't believe he needs to.
So as long as the base is fine.
As long as he's made a calculation. It doesn't matter what the mainstream fake news liberal voters think. It only matters what my people think and what the media they watch believes I should do. I mean, I do think if Fox News was issuing corrections about the thousands of lies this president has said publicly, that would be an issue for this White House, but they don't.
I think Alex has said something very important about the transformation of politics into emotion, and once the personal becomes political, people react to facts through their unconscious biases, or to use the fancy word, the availability heuristics. People tend to believe the tribe or person who they personally identify with. And as early as Jefferson, the founders understood the malleability of the difference between facts and opinions, but it becomes more important to support your camp than to consider facts on the other side, and that is a real problem for democracy.
Can I just use one example of that? Like the Kavanaugh, I keep going back to the Kavanaugh confirmation because I think it crystallizes so much of the dynamics in play. There is now a real question about whether a Supreme Court nominee perjured himself in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that is being met with calls that the left is somehow moving the goalposts, which is a direct admission that somehow the truth is actually just a set of goalposts that can be moved here and there across the field.
I want to go to some question. Oh, you have something here? Please.
Hi, I'm Jean Golden. You talked about the current atmosphere being that of like a circus, and I can only agree with it, not because it's exciting, but I'm thinking of the Circus Act where someone's on a high wire without a safety net, because I'm anxious all the time, and I'm worried that our safety net, meaning, as you pointed out, the Congress not working as well or other parts of the government not working as well with checks and balances, just not functioning as a safety net for us. Thank you.
Is there a net, Jeff?
The net is the Constitution. The net is the Constitution. And the question is, will the Constitution save us if the courts are delegitimized? And it's impossible to understate the significance of the role that John Roberts is going to be playing in this new world. Because if we have a Supreme Court that is routinely overturning decisions by 5-4 votes, regardless of whether Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed or not, the court will appear to be illegitimate in the eyes of at least half the country. He's concerned about this. The justices are concerned about it. Justice Kagan just last week said the whole court's legitimacy depends on popular acceptance, and once that's gone, then the rule of law is under siege. So
Jeff,
it's a very serious
you're a
question.
Supreme Court expert. Let me ask you this directly. Did Brett Kavanaugh disqualify himself for the Supreme Court because he launched what I think everyone would agree, regardless of side, a fairly ferocious attack on liberals, the left, the Clintons, and so on? And the press? As
head of the Nonpartisan National Constitution Center, I can very strongly describe the arguments on both sides. There are arguments on both sides. The argument in favor of his disqualifying himself are that after that screed, he could never be accepted as nonpartisan in any case which involved the people that he denounced, and he will be asked to recuse himself, and that he will also be so angry that it's impossible to him to view things fairly, and for that reason, even if he's innocent of the charges, that he cannot function effectively as a judge. The argument on the other side is that Justice Thomas did go through similar allegations and made a similarly angry response. After he was confirmed to the court, he said, I would have stayed only for 20 years, but now the liberals have pissed me off so much that I'm going to stay forever. And nevertheless, he's proved to be a judge respected and even much liked by his fellow justices, whose opinions have been distinctive, interesting, great to teach as a law professor, and have a strong amount to say for them as an example of constitutional originalism, and therefore his supporters would say that his anger has not influenced his jurisprudence. Those are the arguments on both sides.
Return to the idea, sorry, Dan Delury, want to return to the idea stated earlier that everything that a president, whether it's this president or any other president, says is therefore significant and important and must be covered. News editors every day make decisions on what news should be featured and printed as opposed to other news. And so why is it that whatever the president says, let's take tweets as an example, is significant that it has to be covered?
And in fairness, Trump tweets a lot. Not every tweet is covered. I think that there is some bar that it needs to clear, but you have to understand, people are fascinated by this president. They're enraged by him, they're abhorred by him, they adore him, but people feel very strongly about this president. So there's a very basic calculation that is made, and this is unfortunately a reality of our news media, about viewership and audience. They want to know, right? I mean, there is a circular, it is a snake eating its tail, right? Perhaps if they weren't fed so many Trump tweets, maybe they wouldn't care as much. But again, I mean, there is we go back to the basic calculation. Let's say it's an inflammatory tweet from the President of the United States talking about a policy that matters, or a Supreme Court justice, whatever it is. I mean, there is a feeling that that deserves to be covered, however, in whatever depth.
You know, in the two previous presidents I covered, they move around with stenographers, and the stenographers capture every word spoken by the president because it's the president of the United States. You could argue, as Alex does, that the tweets are actually more important because these are a direct window into what he's actually thinking in real time. This is the most powerful person in the world. This is the man who commands a nuclear arsenal that can destroy the entire world. These are presidential statements. these give us direct insight into how he's thinking, what he's doing, and I don't see any way around them. If these tweets were delivered serially and orally in a press conference, we would of course carry them live. So I can't imagine why we wouldn't focus on them and try to interpret them and understand what this means for his presidency and what it means for America.
Just a quick point to support the question. Brandeis, in his privacy essay, says, once gossip attains the dignity of print, it crowds out the space in the public mind available for discussions of matters of public concern. And that's what's going on. Now, you may be right as an editor, you can't ignore it, but unless the gatekeepers do ignore it, then we're reduced to seeing politics as personal.
I believe we have time for one more short question. Am I correct? Or there's somebody with a mic back here. Sorry, yes.
Hi, my name is Sergio Marzuach. I am from San Juan, Puerto Rico. I'm glad to be here. My question goes back to your prior statement about the change that Twitter and technology has had on politics. But if you look at American history, many presidents have tried to go above and beyond or around the media to reach the people. TR had the bully pulpit, FDR the fireside chats, JFK, LBJ, Reagan had TV. So really, isn't the question more about the character of the person in the office than technology?
Well, I think like all of those sort of parallel mechanisms to communicate with the American public were considered. I mean, Obama went around the media all the time, and I can tell you someone covered the White House. We didn't love it, but that was a concerted effort to get their message communicated, and it was an orchestrated effort. The difference now is the tweets that are issuing forth from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I mean, some of them are sent at 4 o'clock in the morning. They're misspellings. They feel off the cuff, completely immediate. They're really emotionally charged. They are not part of sort of considered dialogue with the American public, and that feels really new and is, to your point, perhaps a reflection of the personal itself, right, of the politician itself. I don't know that there's any other politician or potential presidential nominee that would even think to issue the tweets that this president has. But nonetheless, it's changed the dynamic of like what is acceptable to issue forth to the American public.
To central point, and you could blame it all on the election of 1912. That was when, you know, it all comes back to the progressive era and history, and when Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson ran against William Howard Taft, they insisted for the first time that the president was a steward of the people who should directly channel popular will, and Taft, the doomed constitutionalist, defending the old Madisonian vision that the president is accountable to the Constitution. Now, obviously, the technologies have changed. Twitter is quicker than the radio and the gramophone, but it's populism that is different. The difference between JFK and FDR, who were accountable to political parties, and Roosevelt and Trump, Theodore Roosevelt and Trump, both who were insisting that they alone represent the people and they alone can save it. So the combination of populism plus the new technologies is an explosive combination.
Jeff, Alex, thank you very, very much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jeffrey, Alex, and Jeff. We'd like to conclude the day with Article 1 of the Constitution, the Congress. So we turn to two men at the center of our national conversation right now, both members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and together they are the architects of a process that is playing out right now in real time. They broke away from a leadership meeting to be with us today, and we're grateful to have them. Please welcome Jeff Flake, Republican of Arizona, and Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware. They're here with Jeff Rosen.
Senators Coons and Flake, we invited you to this event about a month ago. Thank you so much for precipitating a constitutional crisis to justify our conversation this morning. For precipitating it and avoiding it. And we are here to discuss gravely serious questions. And that is the future of the Senate as an institution, and that is the future of the Supreme Court as an institution, and how, as you so eloquently said, Senator Flake, to prevent the country from tearing itself apart at a time when the legitimacy of both of those institutions is under siege. I'm required, though, by my editor, Jeff Goldberg, Senator, just to ask the newsy question, just to start us off. So this is from Goldberg. The question is, what is the state of play today, and what would it take for the FBI investigation to reveal to get you to consider voting against Brett Kavanaugh?
Chris?
No.
It almost worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice try.
The state of play today is the investigation is ongoing. They interviewed the first 4 that were named and have branched off from there, is my understanding, and are interviewing additional individuals, and as it should be. And I hope that they follow leads that come from those first interviews. The agreement that we struck, the compromise that we struck, that we'd have something that was limited by time, as Chris outlined it in the speech before we went outside, to 1 week, and then we would limit the scope being limited to current credible allegations. We didn't want to throw something open for allegations to come out like the Rhode Island boat thing that was out and then retracted, or some of the more outlandish ones out there. We checked with DOJ, and they assured us that this was within the time frame that they could do it. We both hope and have been pushing the White House to make sure it's a fulsome investigation, that it's not unduly limited. And I hope they're doing it to find fact. We have not seen any of the reporting yet. We were told it might come back more in real time, and that we might have some decisions to make in terms of where they go. My hope is that as they interview these individuals, then they'll immediately follow up on other leads that they might have. So we don't know exactly where it is in terms of what it will take. I just hope that we find fact, and I have an open mind, just like I had in the hearings, and we'll see what they come back with. I don't want to prejudge it.
Thank you for that. Chris, some Democrats have taken the position that regardless of what emerges from the investigation, the nominee's temperament and conduct in the hearings is disqualifying. Could anything from the investigation make you vote in favor of Kavanaugh?
What I think is important, Jeffrey, about the moment we have here is that as we ground towards the end of Friday's committee deliberations, they got sharper and hotter and more partisan and more personal, to the point where I think Senator Flake correctly perceived that the 9-hour hearing the day before, which had presented 2 compelling, forceful testimonies to completely opposite sets of facts and conclusions, was really having an impact in a lasting way on the credibility of the institution of the Senate. And if the nomination was forced forward with no more further investigation, would have a lasting impact on the credibility of the court. You asked a direct question, I'll give you a direct answer. I had announced a conclusion, in my view, about Judge Kavanaugh based on his jurisprudence before we got to this point. And that's not an opinion that is shared by many Republican colleagues, and I understand that. But what I think Senator Flake did that was exceptional and praiseworthy is to say we have to come closer in terms of our understanding of facts, even though Democrats and Republicans will almost certainly continue to have very different opinions about Judge Kavanaugh from a policy perspective. Jeff's a real conservative. He would like, not to speak for you, but my strong impression is he'd really like a conservative justice on the Supreme Court. I'm not. I really don't want someone with Judge Kavanaugh's views of presidential power or views of substantive due process or likely jurisprudence around privacy and around the most recent significant decisions by Justice Kennedy. So I'm not going to change my views on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination based on that. But I think agreeing that we should have a week for a fulsome but time and scope prescribed FBI investigation, we have to recognize raises the possibility of Kavanaugh being cleared of some or all of these allegations, and the possibility of Dr. Ford being corroborated in some or all of these investigations, and gives us a week to hear each other and to show the American people that we took a week to hear allegations that we've gotten from everywhere. I've had the most amazing couple of days. Literally yesterday in the morning in Delaware, where I woke up, and at a function late at night at a fire hall, I have had women I've known for years or decades come up to me and share with me the most riveting, painful, incredible accounts of sexual assault that they have never shared before, that they haven't shared with their husbands, with their sons, with their family, with their community. And if nothing else was accomplished here, it was a strong signal by Senator Flake that we are willing to take a week to hear each other and to take seriously the idea of improving the facts that we have. It may not change the outcome whatsoever, but it's a really significant statement that the cooling saucer of the Senate can still, though cracked, perform its functions, and that the response Jeff got from you when we walked into the room suggests there is a hunger in the country for this to be not exceptional, but ordinary, for there to be reasonableness, even when we have such sharply different policy views. I genuinely like and admire Senator Flake. And it's... even though we vote opposite ways all the time.
He'll come around. He'll come around.
That's got to be typical, not exceptional.
Let me just say how inspiring it is to hear both of you describe your desire to do exactly what Madison hoped, which is to have senators listen to each other and have the country respect in a deliberative way. And thank you for giving us a week and saving the Senate. But Senator, you care so deeply about the institution. What happens next? He will be corroborated or exonerated, confirmed or not. The partisan passions will be strong and you are retiring. What do you believe will be the future of the Senate after you are gone, and will its institutional legitimacy be preserved?
Right. Well, before I say that, let me just say, you often hear politicians say, "My friend over there," before they try to gouge your eyes out. But when I look at Chris, he truly is my friend, and we have traveled a lot. We both spent part of our misspent youth in Africa, he in Kenya, in East Africa, and me in Southern Africa. And we've traveled to that region, that continent, a number of times. And we've been chased by elephants in Mozambique. We spent a very memorable 4 hours with one of the worst dictators, Robert Mugabe, in Zimbabwe. We've been through a lot, and the trust that you develop working with each other on issues like that, wildlife preservation or Zadara or other issues, that's how compromises are possible. And there's less and less of that going on. I memorably, a few years ago, wanted to prove that Republicans and Democrats could get along, so Martin Heinrich and I marooned ourselves on a Pacific island for a week. Discovery Channel came along and filmed it, called it Rival Survival. Just gave us a machete between us, and that was, no really, you can get it on Amazon for $2.99 still. And I think it's still aired between episodes of Naked and Afraid. We were neither, maybe afraid, but yes. But we got back and went on. David Letterman and Colbert ran a clip of us and said that Flake and Heinrich have proved once and for all Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So unfortunately, that's about where we are. But we, and I do worry about the future of the Senate. It's always been the body that the rules of the Senate bring you together. It's very seldom that one party has 60 votes. And so the filibuster rule requires, and that's what I like about the Senate. I served 12 years in the House. I love the People's House, but the Senate requires and pushes you together. But lately, there have been so many things that simply have drug us apart, and I don't know how we get back. The incentives are all the other way. There's no currency for bipartisanship. If you act bipartisan, it shows up in your opponent's campaign ads. And we've got to come to a point again where the failure to compromise, the failure to reach across the aisle, particularly in the Senate, is punished at the ballot box rather than rewarded. And I don't know how we get there, but we need to.
Chris, if you had to name the 3 top causes of this polarization, what would they be? What can do to fix it? And what are you going to do after Jeff Flake is gone?
Miss him a lot. So, top causes. We don't live together. So we travel back and forth to our home states every week. For Delaware, I've traveled back and forth to my home state almost every day, so I'm an exception. But for most of the Senate, listening to Joe Biden, my predecessor, and asking him how he and John McCain, for example, built a working friendship over decades. Everyone would come in on Monday and stay till Friday, and often move their families here and often live here for long periods of time. So you'd get to know each other as parents at a baseball game or a lacrosse game rather than just as two-dimensional cutouts fighting each other on cable. First, second, cartoon cutouts fighting each other on cable. The disaggregation of news and the, frankly, steady degeneration caused by Twitter and the smash mouth politics of the time. Third, how we raise money. There's no longer a role really for parties. There should be. It's not as strong as it used to be. But you can raise $1 million in your first day as an opponent who's won a primary by being more extreme than the other. In 2010, as you may recall, Mike Castle, a well-respected centrist Republican, was my expected general election opponent. Christine O'Donnell beat him in a primary that had a tiny turnout, very low participation. She raised $1 million the next day on one cable TV show. When you can fuel that, it accentuates the idea that you don't want to live in Washington, you don't want to be part of the swamp. You can appeal to tighter and tighter segments of more and more motivated potential voters or donors using social media and cable. And then what provides you the resources to win is less and less connected to having a broad base of support in your home state. And last, travel. There's 3 things that I think, to answer the opposite, what are 3 things that I think have brought us together? Spending time in places where we aren't surrounded by, forgive me, the press, lobbyists, staff, other folks, working out in the gym, I'm the co-chair of the weekly prayer breakfast that is broadly bipartisan, but is only senators, and traveling overseas. I think Jeff and I, because we spent when we were young men, we spent periods of our lives seeing the United States from another part of the world. We understand the ways in which, when our democracy is dysfunctional, and when the world sees bickering and frankly, gridlock, there are competing models for how to organize society. And on the continent of Africa, they are ascendant. Democracy matters, and we have to act like we care about it and fight for it, because at the end of the day, there's other ways to organize societies. And as the founders saw, if you aren't careful about the mischiefs of faction, you will end up with a country that's no longer a model for democracy.
Let me just same question to you, please. It was beautifully said, and what do you think are the causes of this polarization, and what would you do to fix it? Yeah.
He hit it. Not traveling. I mean, when I got here to Congress in the House, I read the book by Mo Udall, The Job of a Congressman. He felt his desire to, talk about what it was like in the 60s. And I remember reading that. He said, we have in our MRA, or the office budget account, enough money to travel home 3 times a year. Travel back to Arizona 3 times a year. The rest of the time they were here. Their kids went to school together. They associated, and it was just a different environment. I'm not suggesting we'll ever go back to that period, but that's part of the issue now. But I would just add to what Chris says. It's not just the friendships that come. It's just common decency, and we saw a great example of it a few months ago. It was a vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for Mike Pompeo. It was a tight vote, and it was mostly partisan. Johnny Isakson was home delivering a eulogy for his best friend. Johnny has some health issues, and tough for him to, in the middle of the night, travel back for one vote and have to pull everybody in. And there used to be something in Congress, in the Senate in particular, called pairing. If one Democrat had to be gone for some reason, unavoidable, and a Republican friend would say, I'll vote the other way, or I won't vote, to not upset the balance, just as a measure of courtesy, if it wasn't something that would change a huge outcome, but just as something courteous. And Johnny called Chris and asked if he would do that. And Chris did, and it was the first example of that I've seen in years and years and years, and it moved Bob Corker to tears, our chairman, because it's just so infrequent, and that's it's not as much friendships developed or whatever else, but it's just common decency that you just these days it's punished. I remember well when Tim Kaine was picked to be Hillary Clinton's running mate. Tim and I were elected together. We don't agree much, but we work together on a number of things like an AUMF and whatnot, but we disagree a lot. But he's a decent, caring, smart senator. And just as kind of a playful jab, I tweeted out, now I have to count the ways I hate Tim Kaine. But I'm drawing a blank. He's a good man and a good friend. Congratulations. There was immediately unhinged fury from tweets and emails and texts from my side of the aisle saying, how can you do that? And I was even at a Republican event, I kid you not, the next day or 2 days later in Arizona, and somebody came up to me and he said, what's wrong with you? If you can't say anything bad, don't, and he stopped. It was like he was reversing the advice he got from his mother, I'm sure, every day of his life. But that is the result of a shattered politics, and it's where we are, and it's going to be tough to reverse because the incentives all push us that way.
Chris, is this inspiring moment we're having like the false peace in the weeks after Sarajevo? Is this the last time that we'll see two senators discussing the institution? And if Kavanaugh is confirmed, will there be so much partisan bitterness, despite this welcome respite, that the Senate will never recover and Jeff Flake is retiring? And will you ever be able to have these moments of bipartisan comedy again? And what will the consequences be for the country if the Senate explodes in this way?
Look, my wife and I sat down and had a heartfelt conversation. I'm not up this cycle, but I'm up for re-election in 2 more years. And we had a conversation last week, and I'll just be blunt. Is this really worth our time? And I don't mean that it's an incredible honor to serve in the Senate of the United States, but I am enormously frustrated at how little progress we are making tackling the huge issues right in front of us that affect average Americans and that affect our place in the world. And I'm facing a Senate without Senator Flake, without Jeff, without Senator McCain, who was a great partner on foreign policy and security issues, without Bob Corker, who was my most prolific legislative partner on foreign relations. These are 3 folks I've worked very hard to build good relationships with and who've been just tremendous partners. And I said to my wife, I don't know if this is a good investment, but I know this. If the Senate doesn't work, our Constitution, our republic, our nation doesn't work. I cannot abandon this post. If the people of Delaware will have me, I'll do it again. And I want to tell you, but my senior senator faced a significant primary challenge from the left in a way I haven't seen in my state in a long time. And the politics of my party are beginning to resemble the politics of the other party in ways that concern me. So 2 encouraging stories, if I can. Jeff and I went to Senator McCain's funeral together in Phoenix. And when I got back, I made a point of going up to several relatively new senators who I overlap with on a committee, an area of interest, an area of background, but where we don't really know each other that well. And I said bluntly, I want to come get to know you. I want to come to your state. I want to come to your home. I welcome you to mine. I'd like to go to worship together. I'd like to give a speech together. I'd like to find a way to legislate together. Because if there aren't people I can work with, there is really no point in my being here. First. Second, the very kind anecdote that Jeff shared about my doing some very small thing to accommodate my good friend Johnny Isaacson, which should be typical, not exceptional, was occasioned by, and this is meant to be an encouraging story, the day my father died, February last year. I was here in Washington and I got the news in the middle of the night, and I went to the floor and I looked about as miserable as I think I've ever looked. And a senator who I know through prayer breakfast, a very conservative, relatively new senator from South Dakota, Mike Rounds, came across the floor, gave me a hug, looked me in the eye and said, whatever additional votes there are today, Chris, I will pair with you so that you can go be with your family. That touched me deeply. He is going to continue as a senator. Jeff has done amazing work on immigration and has really taken hard chances to accomplish immigration reform. Mike is someone who I hope to legislate with on a range of areas. He was part of that Common Sense Caucus trying to get to a solution on Dreamers and border security. There are folks I am hopeful I can work with. I doubt I will ever get chased by elephants in Mozambique with them.
You'd think those elephants would have a little professional courtesy. No.
But in answer to your question, Jeff, I just wanted to say that, it's up to you. It's up to the citizens of this country to recognize that if you support and advocate for and fund candidates who are unyielding and personally vicious, that's the politics we'll get. This is a democracy. My father served in the 1st Infantry for a reason. My brother in the 2nd Armored for a reason. They weren't there because it was expected and a hobby and a great way to build their resumes. They were there because generations of Americans have stood up for democracy and continue to do so today in hard places around the world. And if we don't feel like we mean it and we're not committed to it, then there are competing models for the world that would be happy to take our place on the world stage and in history. And I am determined that will not happen.
Senator, you gave a very inspiring speech for your determination to unite the country rather than tear it apart. Once you have left the Senate, what will you do to advance that crucially important mission for the future of our republic? I know you're asked if you'll run for president, and I'll ask you that, but in addition, what will you do to shore up the institution of the Senate and to heal this wounded country for the future of America?
Well, I'm not leaving the Senate because it's, I'm tired of this institution, or pox on all your houses. It's a wonderful institution with wonderful people. We've got to find a way to get together. So I simply couldn't run the kind of campaign I felt I needed to run in this environment and succeed. That's the bottom line. But I will stay involved, certainly. I don't know at what level or in what way, but this is important. The Senate, as an institution, has to be there. It's the bulwark, particularly when we're talking about foreign policy, as Chris is. The Senate has always been, with the 6-year terms, the body, with roles that the House doesn't have in terms of advice and consent on ambassador nominees and the President's cabinet and the court, but the ability with a longer term to see beyond the hill and to develop relationships. You saw Senator McCain, the relationships he built around the world. And much of Senator McCain's final year in the Senate were spent reassuring allies that we are still their allies. That's important, and whatever role I can play outside of this body, I'll play, because it's vital, it's important. The Senate as an institution needs to return to its former glory, I guess it put it that way, as the most deliberative body in the world, and it would be tough to make the case that it is right now. So I will play a role. I will stay involved.
Let's talk about the institutional legitimacy of the Supreme Court. If Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed, Chris, there will be some Democrats who will refuse to accept his legitimacy because of his statements in the hearings. And we face the prospects of 5-4 decisions of Republicans against Democrats in ways that could fundamentally undermine faith in the rule of law. Much will turn on Chief Justice John Roberts in an effort to avoid this. Tell us what you think Roberts must do, should do, in order to preserve the legitimacy of the court. Are you concerned about its legitimacy, and what would be the consequences of citizens losing faith in the nonpartisan legitimacy of the rule of law?
Partly why this moment is so powerful and so fraught is that we have asked the Supreme Court to be the arbiter, the deciding point for some of our most personal, passionate, powerful issues as a country. So in the arc of our lifetimes, you know, from racial integration to gun ownership, from marriage equality to now sexual harassment, issues have been put onto the court that cannot be easily resolved in legislative processes and that have taken a constitutional hue, but in some ways define our sense of ourselves and our scope and our role as citizens. How much can we contribute and to whom, Citizens United? Can the government surveil our most private communications? How do we treat those who are captured in the course of combat? The Supreme Court is the place that we look to in the last 60, 70 years to make these values decisions for the country. We've been able to have it play that role and not tear the country apart, partly because of this legitimacy, which is intensely fragile. The point of the robes is to make them all sort of look more similar. They don't have an army, as I think President Jackson memorably pointed out. Their force is in their credibility as independent arbiters of the Constitution. It is gravely at risk. The way we've conducted ourselves as senators, the way we talk to each other, the way we describe these issues, and the ways in which Judge Kavanaugh's character and credibility have been challenged and put on trial, and ways in which he spoke to us as a committee that I thought were overly partisan. All of this is a steamy jambalaya that goes right at the credibility of the court. Chief Justice Roberts, I believe, is an institutionalist who understands how fragile the credibility of the court is. And, my hope is that we will conduct ourselves, even though it is inevitable there will be deep bitterness and anger and frustration at the outcome of this nomination, no matter how it ends, is that we will reduce the frequency with which we describe judges as wearing blue and red jerseys. In casual conversation, we now say, so-and-so, comma, an Obama judge, so-and-so, comma, a Bush judge, so-and-so, comma, a Trump judge, as if that tells you exactly what they will decide. There are 2 new federal judges in Delaware where I worked well and professionally and easily with Don McGahn. They are Trump nominees. Senator Carper and I returned blue slips. They were confirmed nearly unanimously by the by the Senate, and I think will serve admirably and long on our court. Do I think it is fair to them to call them Trump judges with the opprobrium that brings in my party, or to have the other party call them Trump judges with an expectation that tells you the arc of their judicial service? No. And we've allowed that approach We do wear red and blue jerseys. We are elected as members of parties and as partisans. We work hard to respect each other and know each other across that, but our judiciary has now been profoundly affected by the way we behave and speak. I think we are really at risk of losing that. And so, you know, Jeff spoke early on in this exchange about the ways the Senate is different from the House. Changing the rules on confirmation of judges, something Democrats did first and then Republicans followed our lead. Not having a 60-vote threshold. Long periods of obstruction, holding certain seats open, refusing to confirm qualified nominees of the other party. I mean, part of Lindsey Graham's white-hot anger was because he voted for Sotomayor and for Kagan and cannot believe it is legitimate for someone like me to not be voting for a Judge Gorsuch, given his credentials. So I'm just citing an example that Lindsey and I had a conversation about. So, you know, there's a lot of he said, she said, back and forth, dislike, distrust between senators on this. If we have a court that begins to behave in a way you really can predict exactly how they will decide for the rest of their careers based on who nominated them, heaven help us, because the court cannot become as partisan and divided as the Congress and as the country.
Senator, I'll just ask, what are your concerns about the future legitimacy of the court? What can Chief Justice Roberts do? And if Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed, some Democrats are talking about impeaching him in the House or packing the size of the Supreme Court, increasing it to 13 justices, as was done in 1800 and during the Civil War. What would you say to those Democrats about the effect of that on the future legitimacy of the rule of law?
Well, it's tough. I mean, that was just, Chris just gave a tutorial on what, and don't expect me to weave in steamy jambalaya into any political discussion. It's incredible. When I walked into that room on Friday and saw the food fight that was going on between our parties, just split on the dais, Democrats threatening to walk out and not even vote in the final vote, just going back and forth, just this vitriol. That's when I sat there, and then it came to Chris, and Chris gave a very sober, rational speech about, you know, how we could move forward. I thought that's what we've got to do, because the Supreme Court is still the last bastion of the last, you know, institution that most Americans have faith in. And as Chris mentioned, that's how it has worked for us to cede so much authority and give so much power to the Supreme Court, because people still have faith. If that faith is gone, then heaven help us. And so it is a concern. I was very troubled by the tone of the remarks. The initial defense that Judge Kavanaugh gave was something like, I told my wife, I hope that I would sound that indignant if I felt that I was unjustly, you know, maligned. But then it went on, and the interaction with the members was sharp and partisan, and that concerns me. And I tell myself, you give a little leeway because of what he's been through. But on the other hand, we can't have this on the court. We simply can't. And, you know, talk of impeachment or stacking the court, it's going the wrong direction. And, I mean, this dysfunction has many fathers. We can go back to, you know, statements made in the 1980s with Bork or Clarence Thomas hearings, or you name it. You can find a villain anywhere back there. The truth is both parties have engaged in it and have made the situation worse. And we simply have to elevate people to leadership positions and elect people who see it differently and understand the value and purpose of the Supreme Court. I do worry. This red and blue jerseys referring to each other, or these justices, by who nominated them. It just it can't go on.
As Lincoln said, I'm loath to close, but I can't, I must ask you each for very short final thoughts. Lincoln in 1838, as we talked about earlier, warned about mobocratic government and feared that when citizens lose their allegiance to the rule of law, then liberty and the republic will falter. Chris, what is at stake in this moment when the legitimacy of the Senate and the Supreme Court are under siege, and what do you want to tell your fellow citizens about what they can do about it?
I want to tell my fellow citizens first that Jeff Flake is an earnest, decent, thoughtful, kind man, a good husband and father, and someone who deeply respects our democracy and the rule of law. And I hold that opinion fiercely about him, despite our being from different parties, different states, different backgrounds, and different frames of reference, and despite our voting records being so sharply divergent. And if citizens can't hear and respect and recognize ways in which senators, presidents, members of the House can interact with each other in a more respectful and decent and thorough way, then I'm gravely concerned about the future of the rule of law, respect for core institutions of our society, and the ways in which the rest of the world sees us. We are an exceptional experiment in human history. Rarely, if ever, has a continental power assembled itself to be governed by its own people in an act of original creation that was exceptional but profoundly flawed, and then gradually, diligently over the decades expanded the scope of justice, expanded the definition of citizenship, expanded the access to opportunity in ways that gradually made true, or more true, its opening promises. We are an exceptional nation, and we are at risk of losing it all through a populist mob mentality where no one can win because everyone must lose. It's up to you, folks. And I just have eternal gratitude to my friend Jeff for making us take 1 week and look at each other and hear each other and respect each other.
Senator, the last word, very appropriately, is to you, your thoughts and concerns about the future of the Republic and the rule of law, and what is your message about what citizens can do about it?
I feel like reaching over and just dropping Chris's mic. I can't add to that. This guy is incredible. And the thing that I will miss most about the Senate is relationships like this, and being able to work together with people who I view as true statesmen in every sense of the word. And you know, this notion that we have to see each other differently, or just one example, I was on that baseball field in June of 17, and when the gunman opened fire, and I just remember running to the dugout and seeing the bullets pitch off the gravel in front of me after Steve Scalise went down and whatnot. But if there's a memory of that stays in my mind, it's that turning and seeing that and just thinking, and it seemed like an eternity, why us? Why here? How can someone look on a field at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball, trying to relive their youth, and see the enemy? And that's what this type of politics is bred. And we've just got to get beyond it, where we look at each other across the aisle and not see the enemy, but to see. I mentioned last night. It's as if you want to heal yourself, to heal your own brain by taking out your heart. We are different parties, but we're part of the same organ, the same body. And you've got to work together here. Rarely does a party, like I said, have 60 votes. It would be horrible if that came to be for an extended period of time. We've got to find a way to look at each other and trust each other again, and not question each other's motives. And if we can do that, then we can be worthy of this republic that we have.
Ladies and gentlemen, for their service to the United States of America, please join me in thanking Senators Coons and Flake.
Thank you, Senators, for being here, and as Jeff said, for your service to the nation. This should be an interesting and historic week, fraught and powerful, as Senator Coons said. As we conclude now, I'm grateful to the National Constitution Center, now known forever as the anti-Twitter, as Jeff Rosen put it, for its support. I urge you all to go visit NCC in Philadelphia, across from Independence Hall. And thanks to all of you for being here. I know your time is very valuable. Even so, we hope to see you again this afternoon at 2 p.m. at Harmon Hall, Harmon Theater, when the Atlantic Festival main stage programming begins with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in conversation with, who else? Jeffrey Goldberg. There are still tickets available to the festival for purchase. We have a team waiting for you over at the AT&T Ideas headquarters at Rosa Mexicano at 7th and F. Go on over there and you can get tickets. And be sure to tell them you came from this morning's event. So again, thank you all for being here and enjoy the Atlantic Festival.